In conversation with.
Welcome back, everybody. Our next session is not just going to be a live session here on our Republica Channel 1 stage, but it's also going to be part of a podcast recording. Jillian, I warned you, we started a podcast at the beginning of this year called That Time of the Month, where we speak about technology, digital rights, feminism, and other fun things. For this episode, we are thrilled to be joined by a true Republica veteran. She's practically part of the Republica family already. We're here today with Jillian York, who's the Director of Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And it's congratulations time because you've had that position for 10 years already. And you also published your first book recently, Silicon Values, which is what we'd like to be talking about with you today. Thanks so much for being with us, Jillian.
Yeah.
And so great to see you in real life.
It's great to see you too. It's been so long.
It has been way too long.
It's been a long time. Jillian, we usually start with a quick round of questions like this and that questions.
All right.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Berlin or San Francisco?
Berlin.
Kitten or puppy?
Puppy.
Fusion or Burning Man?
Fusion.
Lean in or lie down?
Lie down.
Zuckerberg or Bezos?
Ooh. Neither?
Okay.
Fair enough, yeah. What should be the next party motto? Nipples and nachos or whiskey and wigs?
Ooh. Nipples and nachos.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is a great transition.
Yeah, I love it.
So, as I said, we want to be talking to you today about the first book you've published, which is super exciting, Silicon Values, and of course, zoom in on the topic of content moderation. So nipples is a great keyword. But before we dig really deep into that, we've said it a number of times today, it's our 15th anniversary, 15 years of your Publica, but also pretty much, yeah, you've been in the business of content moderation and the digital rights field that you've been working in for about 15 years yourself as well. As I just said, 10 years at EFF. So I wanted to start off by asking you, if you were to put like a bracket around your career so far, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, I think, it's also 10 years for me with Republica. So, yeah, I think for me, the brackets around the career would be about freedom of expression, but also about challenging power. I've worked on content moderation, of course, government censorship and surveillance, as you know. And I think all of that really comes down to standing with the people against power.
Yeah, and over the last 10 years, you've given a number of really fantastic talks at Republica and other conferences in Berlin, like the Netzpolitik Festival as well. And yeah, in a number of those talks, you've addressed some of the topics that are also addressed in your book, especially topics around how US platforms have shaped the internet, but of further culture around the world in the last years. And the sort of idea that we're exporting US Puritanism around the world and shaping really the morals of the internet that way. So we wanted to start out by asking you, can you describe some of the ways in that kind of moral policing takes place that you've observed over the years?
Sure. I mean, I think that the most obvious one, I grew up in the US, and on television there, you see lots and lots of violence in primetime television. Shows like Law and Order, show dead bodies readily. But when it comes to nudity, everything is very, very censored. I remember being very shocked as a child when they aired Schindler's List on television and showed nude bodies. And that was the one exception that was made because of the gravity of the story. So yeah, there's this real kind of reversal. When I came here, seeing how violence is less acceptable in the mainstream, whereas nudity is perfectly fine. So I think that it's really important to consider the fact that it's not just the US laws or norms that govern the way that these platforms operate, but the ideas and ideologies that the CEOs and founders bring to the table.
Let's stick with the topic nudity a little bit, and also artistic expression maybe, because oftentimes when we read about platform censorship in the media, it's about political speech. But what I really like about your work is that you also focus on on artistic expression and on marginalized communities, vulnerable groups. You talk about sex workers or burlesque dancers here in Berlin or elsewhere. And so let's maybe talk a little bit, how have they been affected by platform censorship during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, this has really become a critical issue. Using Berlin as the context, I think it's really interesting because a lot of the things that are maybe a little bit more of a legal gray area in the U.S. are perfectly legal here. And I have friends who are burlesque dancers who work in sex-adjacent industries who have had themselves kicked off Twitch, off of Instagram, maybe Patreon, various platforms because of the work that they do. And as freelancers, they're also kind of struggling and not necessarily entitled to the same benefits as regular workers. And so they're really in a precarious position when they can't, apply for money from the state necessarily, but also cannot access fundraising opportunities online.
Yeah, so they were kicked off the platforms, but sometimes we see that certain platforms are not available for communities abroad. I think Grindr is an example, right, or was an example for LGBTQI+ communities. So how come? How are these decisions made? Like, why are some platforms not available in some Arabic-speaking countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex legal web. On the one hand, you've got, norms, ideologies that the companies bring to the table. You have laws such as things like the sanctions that the U.S. imposes on certain countries that disable certain platforms from being available in places like Iran and Syria. And then you also have the governments themselves, foreign governments, that restrict access to certain websites and apps.
And yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, and who decides this? Like, are they getting consulting? Are they getting consulting from companies that are doing like media research or marketing research, or like how are these decisions made?
That's the really troubling thing. It depends on the company. So Facebook, for example, has a tendency to kind of play both sides. They'll reach out to, free expression groups like EFF, Human Rights Watch, perhaps, but they'll also reach out to special interest groups that might have a more, particular idea of what they want to see. And then they'll say, look, we talked to both sides of the issue. Some of the other platforms are a little bit better about this. They'll consult with a more diverse range of groups, but ultimately what we really see is that these platforms tend to reach out to American organizations more than they do groups from the Global South or even Europe.
I think that's something we want to dig a bit deeper because it's also something you describe in different places in your book, what these interactions look like between the large platforms and digital rights activists or other civil rights groups. And yeah, I mean, I guess there's so many examples. I read another case of Airbnb, for instance, taking people who they thought were sex workers off their platform, even though they were definitely not using Airbnb places to have sex in, but just to have a holiday in. And this sort of assumption that that you can judge a person, dig in their background, and then just throw them off their platform. And it, of course, makes it especially hard if you don't have anybody defending the rights of those people in an organized way that the platform's then going to talk to and have a conversation with.
This is where it gets really complicated. If I recall correctly, the Airbnb policy that you mentioned was actually put in place around 2016 when Charlottesville happened, and the idea behind it was to prevent white supremacists or Nazis from renting Airbnbs. Now, I mean, I think that that's something that most of us can agree on, and yet any policy like that looks into people's lives outside of their actual behavior on a platform will have implications for other groups, and now we're seeing it with sex workers.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to be really careful when we push for any kind of censorship, because it always ends up trickling down.
Right. I was wondering a little bit, this kind of moral policing, it would be naive, to think anything else but that this is a continuation of the way that US does foreign politics around the world. Like, I was recently reading, Alex, the program chef of Republica, recommended a fantastic podcast called The Wind of Change, which is all about how the CIA wrote The Wind of Change, which is not proven, but it's super funny and interesting to listen to, and goes through examples like Dr. Zhivago or CIA hosted Nina Simone concerts, and the way that culture has always been used to sort of spread politics around the world. So is this just a continuation, except on a much broader scale, because the internet is far more reaching than sending book copies into a country?
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, right? Because on the one hand, the internet has enabled artists and everyone really to reach different audiences that they never would have otherwise. I mean, there are people now who are getting record deals or on TV, people that we never saw represented in our youth. And I think that that's really important. But the flip side of that is that all of these platforms that enable all of that great stuff to happen also enable bad actors.
Yeah. We just had an interview with Margarete Vestager on Channel 2, and it was also a lot about some of these big questions and also sort of, geopolitical positioning. And sometimes when I think about these things, I feel like the internet has become this bad bar joke. Like you walk into a bar and there's a Facebook guy who's actually working for CIA, a Russian troll, and a Chinese state employee waiting there. And then where does Europe feature? Where in this joke does Europe come in? Do you see a role for Europe in this current geopolitical game?
I do. I think that the GDPR is a really good example of something that has brought the conversation in a different direction around privacy, although it has its flaws. And I think that Europe needs to learn to be more agile, to be quicker to respond, and to listen more to the experts, to the digital rights organizations. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that's been most disappointing to me, especially most recently with the passing of the terrorism regulation. It's really clear that the MEPs just didn't listen to the constituents who were saying, hey, this is going to cause damage and harm to people.
Talking about Europe, I'm sure you've heard about the digital sovereignty discussions that we're having here. We're talking a lot about digital infrastructure. There's also several scholars who are researching this. I think Ethan Zuckerman just wrote a book about digital infrastructure as well. And they're talking about public interest technology and public interest digital infrastructure and about their visions for it. So what would your vision or your take for the public digital infrastructure be that we need in the future? Who has to run it? Who should run it? Who should fund it maybe as well?
Yeah, this is where I really have to channel my colleagues. Cindy Cohen and Danny O'Brien have been doing incredible work on this. They're both at EFF around what they call the public interest internet. And we've got a podcast out about this and some blog posts. But really, I think the key here is protocols over platforms. Remember back in the day, we all used to chat on XMPP. We were able to use whatever tool we wanted to find each other. I think that now what we're seeing is this ownership by companies or even benevolent groups like Signal, where you can only use their platform. You can't port your data elsewhere. You can't talk to people through another channel. And I think that that's really what we want to see things go back to.
Yeah, this is also actually a good segue into someone who will be speaking later that day. Michael Seemann, his book is also here. He talks about the power of platforms. And he also talks a lot about protocols. So that's just for later people who want to dig a little deeper into that topic.
I think I obviously completely agree. This idea that we've ended up with all these traps, basically, all these lock-in environments, and this concept of like open APIs and interfaces and inter-exchange and operability, what the internet is or was or should be built on, is sort of like trailed off. But how do we get back there, especially seeing the extreme power concentration? Like we talk a lot about platforms and how problematic they are on a communications level, but looking at platforms on an infrastructural level and seeing that the internet is built on Amazon, how do we break this power concentration open again?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I mean, I admit that I'm not the one who's, doing the foremost thinking on this. I think, I'd look to Cory Doctorow and his ideas around adversarial interoperability, kind of forcing companies to be more interoperable with each other. I do think that we have to break up the platforms, but I don't think that it's going to solve all of the speech issues. And so we've got to come at this from a multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, break up the monopolies. On the other hand, we are going to need to regulate in some way. I just don't want to see it as regulation of speech so much as regulation of infrastructure and design.
Yeah, absolutely. So regulation of speech, content moderation, let's go on a little bit of a tour, perhaps. You outline this super nicely in your book, this idea of back in the Wild West when the platforms were young and people just started something without thinking of the implication or consequences, or maybe didn't want to think of it. And this sort of idea, I think you describe one place in your book where it's like, a bunch of MySpace employees were watching porn together and then realized they have to have content moderation. Those are the early days. And of course, it's been a long journey to where we are now. Can you just give us a little bit of a sketch from that Wild West and what things were like back then and how we got to a place where we are today?
Sure. I mean, that Wild West is how I got here in the first place. I think I remember back in 2011, 2010 maybe, when Marcus Beckedahl reached out to me, found me on the internet, something that I'd written, and brought me here to Berlin to speak at Republica. So it really was a wonderful time. And yet at the same time, I think it's important for us to remember that the reason we see it that way is because we were the people who were online, we're the elites in some sense. Over the years, as more and more people, and this is a good thing, have been able to access the internet, we're seeing more and more social issues come into the online space. And I think really the problem here is the way that these capitalist corporations have kind of come in and exerted control over our expression and over our data. And, in the book I describe the period of around 2013, 2014 as being kind of a tipping point for a lot of these issues with online harassment, the rise of the alt-right and white supremacy, and the rise of the Islamic State.
Yeah, so when we maybe try to summarize it a little bit for our audience, what do you see, because it's such a complex topic, right? What do you see as the key challenges regarding content moderation as we see it today with the platforms, and then maybe also going into regulation? What are your recommendations when it comes to regulation? Because we all know Facebook will be able to afford the regulation, but smaller players might not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, absolutely, just bottom line, is diversity and inclusion. And this means at every level of these companies. We know from the work of people like Sarah Roberts that the laborers who make the content moderation decisions are often very low paid, third-party employees. Those folks deserve to be treated much better than they are right now, and because they're handling some of the most difficult problems. And then the next step, I think, is to make sure that the boardrooms, the executive rooms, are truly diverse and inclusive. I mean, I think it's not surprising that the CEOs of all of these companies are white American men. That has to change. So do the boards. And then finally, when it comes to regulation, again, I do think that companies should be able to exercise discretion over what they moderate, which I know is a shift from things that I might have said 10 years ago. But at the same time, I don't want to see the government step in and say, you can't say this, for the most part. And so what we need to regulate is things like transparency, accountability, requiring companies to have appeals systems, due process. Those are some of the steps that I would like to see taken.
Yeah, talking about transparency, I mean, for your book, obviously you talk to a lot of people, and a lot of the people who are working at big tech companies have signed NDAs and can't really talk about this stuff. So I'm wondering, at what level of transparency are we? How do you find out, or how do governments find out how content is moderated these days?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we've seen a seismic shift over the past few years. I feel like it started sometime around 2017, where we've seen people inside companies willing to break their NDAs and speak to the public. In this past week, as we've seen a lot of content being taken down around the Palestine conflict, there have been people who've spoken out against that, who worked at these companies, who said, hey, look, this is what I've seen. And, it's funny because even for my book, while I was writing it between, I guess, 2016 and 2020, it was difficult for me to find people who were willing to speak on the record. Either they were, long back former high-level employees, or they were people who spoke to me on the condition of anonymity. And even that has changed in the past, 24 months.
I was wondering, I mean, we've all been in the trap of, I think most of us and a lot of our viewers will have definitely had the experience of what it's like either to try to report something and to be in the trap of the platform saying, no, this is fine by our community standards, and you're looking at it thinking, but it can't possibly be, or to have been, to have your own account blocked or something, and then this I wish I could talk to a human, wishing there was some human down the road that you could reach, on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is also something you go into your book, and we've had in other Republica situations, the human side of content moderation is the worst job thinkable in the world, really. I get goosebumps when I think of the cleaners and everything that we learned through that work. Do you have an assessment, following up to Julia's question, acceptable forms of regulation, or what should we be going for in the mix between automated and personal content moderation, and where the human should come in?
Yeah, I believe that there needs to always be a human in the loop. Now, we don't have to have humans looking at the absolute worst things. As Dave Wilner, who's one of Facebook's early policy architects, described to me, automation is kind of good for some things. It's good for saying, hey, this is a book, identifying a picture of a book and classifying that and saying, okay, book, we'll put it here. But when it comes to nuanced things like speech, videos of conflicts, all sorts of different things, it's very difficult to detect that with automation. And yet companies have been doing that, and even more so during the pandemic. And so it's fine to use automation to flag the worst of the worst. The violent acts, child sexual abuse imagery, hash databases are excellent for this. But for the rest of these issues, I think that we do need human nuance applied to the situation. And so automation can be a good first step, a flag, but a human should see the next step. And then, of course, as you mentioned, customer service is really key. It's incredible to me, growing up in the US where customer service is such a prominent thing in every aspect of life, that Silicon Valley has kind of left that behind.
Yeah.
I just had to think of this story. Was it the search engine Bing, like the breast censoring?
Yeah.
You can talk about this way better than I can. I just had to think about this. When you automate it, then you might end up censoring too much.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good example, and it seems kind of old school, but it still applies today. I mean, the story is basically that about 10 years ago, Microsoft Bing launched with censorship in place for a number of different countries, including all of the Arab world. And what they were trying to do was censor things like breast, but what they ended up doing was censoring chicken breast and breast cancer. And I know, it's ridiculous, but we see this still. Last week, there was an example from Palestine where Al-Aqsa, the name of a mosque, which also happens to be contained within the name of a terrorist organization, the mosque, references to the mosque got censored because of that keyword.
Let's stay there, because I was listening to a podcast yesterday where Dia Kayali talked about the massive censorship, removal, suppression of content that is going on in Palestine. We see that all the time. Also 2 weeks ago in India, when the government asked Facebook, Twitter to take down posts or to censor some hashtags. And some might say, okay, the social media companies are just abiding like rules and laws, but oftentimes there's this big gray area and we don't know what exactly happens behind the scenes. So what is your take on that? What would your advice for these companies be when it comes to not only being more transparent about what they do, but also, do you think they're just abiding the laws, or what are things where we have to differentiate?
Yeah, I mean, this is another situation where it's really complex. In the past few weeks, the flashpoint countries have been, as you said, India and Palestine, and also Colombia, where there have been protests happening and police brutality. And in each of these situations, there are, of course, differences in how governments react to the companies. But what they all have in common is that they're, profitable markets for these platforms. And so the platforms have an incentive to respond to whatever the government tells them to do. And also, we've seen with some of the Facebook Oversight Board decisions, like one yesterday with relation to Turkey, that sometimes the governments, over time, their requests end up having an influence over global policy entirely. And so there's those issues, plus, again, automation being brought in, and you end up with a lot of things being taken down that shouldn't be. And I think that in that situation, it's just really important for companies to think ahead rather than being reactive. They need to be proactive in ensuring that they have expertise dealing with a certain situation.
Yeah, so what role do civil society organizations play in all of this? You mentioned EFF, right?
Yeah.
So companies reach out to you and you advise them sometimes, but there's also a lot of civil society organizations on the ground. What is their role?
Yeah, I mean, so the role that they play is an exhausting one for sure. Since we're talking about the past 15 years, I mean, one of the most beautiful things that I've seen happen is this growth of civil society and digital rights organizations all over the world, and especially in the region that my book is mostly about. Right now, as we're talking about Palestine, there's a large number of organizations in Palestine, in Israel, in Lebanon, throughout the region who are all working together. I mean, they've been coordinating in a private group to capture incidents, to talk to companies, to do press. I mean, it's really impressive how people come together and triage these situations, and often for just so much less pay than what the companies are paying.
So we touched on this earlier, and you also mentioned the topic of diversity. How are what are interaction possibilities? Where do people sit at a table together and get to speak to one another? Like there's a place quite early on in the book where you also mention what in the early days dialogue with platforms like Facebook used to look like, and how they were also seeking out contact with digital rights experts or activists to have, some kind of rapport going, of course, always mainly in their boardroom or along their rules. Have platforms changed to have more dialogues also with local civil rights organizations? And is there more sitting at the table together also on other people's terms today?
In some ways it's better, and in some ways it's worse. So back then, the companies were reticent to talk to civil society groups in other countries. I mean, Nicole Wong, who's incredible, she worked at Google in the early days, she said, they simply didn't know who to trust. And so, of course, they relied on US groups. Over time, I was one of the people who worked to bring Global South groups into the room to say to the companies, hey, you can't just rely on me for expertise on the region. I'm not an expert, It's those people are the ones giving me the information in the first place. Talk to them directly. And so over time, the companies really have done that. But at the same time, as these companies have grown, they're often sending, their local representatives who don't have as much power as the people in the executive rooms to talk to local organizations. And therefore, you're not really seeing those ideas trickle up the way that they should be. Now, I think it's really important to note that there are incredible people working on the ground at the companies too. They just don't have the power. The power is really concentrated in the hands of a few.
I remember, I think it was also a podcast where you talked about this, that you used to write, you're still writing a lot about these issues, and then the companies reached out to you and were like, hey, we can directly talk about this in our back room. And did you have the feeling they wanted you to stop writing about these issues and only consult?
I'm glad you asked me that. Yeah, they first reached out to me. It was actually also over Palestine. The word Palestinian had been blocked from
titles of groups.
Yeah. You couldn't say like Palestinian Music Organization. It would just block it, but you could say American, right? And so I wrote a blog post about this, and Facebook reached out to me, and of course they said it was a bug. Now, often I think that when it's a bug, it was actually a malicious employee putting something on a block list. But nevertheless, that began a dialogue, and for the most part it was good, but I do remember one instance where I'd blogged angrily, possibly even drunk, about something that Facebook had done, and the next morning, I think it was like 6 a.m., I got a call from one of their PR people saying, like, if you write like that, we're not going to keep talking to you. And I said, yeah, I'm not going to stop doing that. That's up to you. But I think then I started at EFF, and they really didn't have any choice.
Well done.
Talking about Facebook, I think everyone by now, due to the Trump kind of decision, the decision whether Trump should be blocked from Twitter and also Facebook, everyone knows about the oversight board that they installed last year. So the companies are doing some things, but are that the right approaches, or is that approach flawed? Or what's your opinion on the oversight board? We don't have to talk about the Trump decision, but they also you mentioned Turkey, and they've been taking many other decisions that were not in the media and not in the spotlight. What were they talking about, discussing, and what do you think about this approach?
Yeah, I think that I'm really wary of anyone who's like, oh, the oversight board is terrible, or oh, it's fantastic. I really kind of come down in the middle. I think that they did a good thing by instituting something innovative. They did a bunch of public consultations. I was at the one in Berlin, although I will say they didn't take all of our ideas into account. I wish they had. But, there are some great people on that board. There are some people on that board that I don't think should be there. But ultimately, I'm happy to see them doing something innovative. And, the Trump decision for me was really kind of, I'm not sure the right phrase, but a distraction, let's say. Because some of the other decisions that they made have actually been really important. I mentioned the one about Turkey yesterday. It was something that on the face looked like hate speech, but was actually satire criticizing the Turkish government. And any Turkish expert would have looked at that and said, yep, that's what that is. Right now, they've got an open call, and anyone can submit, which is really cool. I'm about to do one myself around a situation in Myanmar. And so I think it is really important, but we can't see it as the be-all, end-all like Mark Zuckerberg wants to.
It's very important. I don't think we've had many positive things said about Facebook on our stages. So it's very interesting to see that you think things are moving. And the pressure got so so much from all sides that I guess they had to now show that they're interested in changing something. And as you said, it's going to be interesting to see how far that's going to go and how much of symbolic action it's going to be, or if there's any possible change within that what we would perceive as a very broken system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no fan of Facebook myself. I don't even really use it. I do use Instagram, as you know. But I get really skeptical of the whole, like, let's just boycott Facebook approach, because that doesn't cater to the needs of so many people around the world who rely on it.
Absolutely. I mean, I can just say we've had and we have this discussion often, trying to move some of our communications outside of Facebook-owned chat. And it's just so hard if you're operating an international network with many countries where other systems just aren't either reachable because they're banned in the country, or where these apps have been zero-rated, and if people don't have a lot of money, having a change to a system where they might have to pay the data is severe. So there's a lot of things that, like you said, if you're working in global environments or you're working with different communities across the world, keep us on these platforms.
Exactly. I mean, we have to work to build alternatives. That's really important. But we also have to work to make these platforms better. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah. So you said you opted really quickly for Berlin in the beginning when we did our either-or questions. And I was wondering, obviously we're really happy that you opted for Berlin as your hometown. And by that answer, hopefully we'll be staying here as well. But the question would be, like, there's always been a lot of debates also amongst digital rights activists from the US and Germany, because sometimes we have different understandings of what we mean by freedom of speech. And I was wondering if you feel that your own perception on this topic has changed since you've been based here.
Yeah, I mean, it has in some ways, and in some ways it hasn't. I mean, I'm still very wary of leaving decisions up to authority to decide what is or is not hate speech. I understand why Germany has the laws that it does, and yet at the same time, I'm concerned that applying those laws only to a certain group of people and not to other people is problematic. I mean, there's a lot of people that you can engage in hate speech against in Germany without many repercussions, as you know. And so I think that, yeah, on the one hand, I do in daily life like the approach. I especially like the behavior of solidarity and the ways that bars are like, hey, you can't come in here if you're sexist, racist, transphobic, etc. That's fantastic. I would love to see companies kind of apply that same principle. But, on the other hand, there are things that I like about the US approach too, which is really to not trust authority.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left, and I'm super curious because you wrote this book during the pandemic. What is it like to write a book during a time where we all have to stay at home and not a lot of distraction and not a lot of creative input as well? So
I got lucky because I'd written probably 60 out of 80,000 words before the pandemic, and so it was really the last stretch. And if you recall, last year we had that early spring happen, so I wrote the last bit of my book on my balcony, like in the sun. It was pretty wonderful, to be honest. And I think I started it in Vibali, actually, like in my head. So yeah, it was quite a journey over a period of a few years. But yeah, and I think honestly, the nicest thing about promoting it during a pandemic has been that when I finish a talk, usually I can just go and fall asleep on my couch.
The benefits of the home office or home event. Jillian, it's been wonderful to have you here. And thank you so much for not just writing the book, but also being here today and introducing our listeners, our audience, to Silicon Values. I hope they all go out and buy it and read it. And I hope we get to have another session at next year's Republica with a lot of audience. Maybe it's fair to say this time, as some people want to go do some historical viewing, that my favorite talk of yours of all times is, and will always be, the Spy Animals talk. So
yeah, and hopefully we'll come back with the sequel soon.
I would love that. I would love that very much. Ja, und jetzt geht's weiter in unserem Programm auf Kanal 1 und Kanal 2. Auf Kanal 2 starten wir jetzt mit Statement Talks, und zwar zum Thema KI und Biotech, zum Thema Digital Libraries und Art in the Age of Digitization. Und auf Kanal 1 geht's hier weiter mit einem Statement Talk zu KI und Kollaboration. Gefolgt von der Session trifft ein Musiker einen Programmierer und danach natürlich auch dem schon angekündigten Wunschkonzert mit Enno Bunga. Viel Spaß dabei.